Welcome everyone to our live broadcast. This is our first program from Kyiv since the last Russian massive air attack throughout Ukraine. The new hidden terrorist action of the great Russian warlords was predicted even by Ukrainian first graders. It was obvious to all our school children, their parents and their teachers. The neo-KGB regime of Putin simply could not resist bombing Ukraine on the birthday of the world's most famous fighter for Ukrainian independence, the great poet Taras Shevchenko. In honor of this, Moscow has carried out more than 80 air attacks on our territory, and for the first time in the history of full-scale Russian aggression, the Kremlin launched 6 deadly Kinzhal missiles at once. Thus, the Russians responded 2 weeks later to an airstrike against their $330 million airliner. The A-50 aircraft directed Russian fighters' jets Kinzhal missile on Ukrainian territory using the Shmel radar system. Exactly this equipment, as well as the avionics and fuselage of targeting aircraft with a total weight of more than 20 tons, were destroyed by the combat drones. The official speakers of the Belarusian cyber partisan movement, Juliana Shemetovets, speaking live from New York, USA. Glad to see you, Juliana. Do your cyber partisans movement have a hand in the attack of the Russian aircraft A-50, which was directing Kinzhal missiles at Ukraine?
Hello, thank you for having me and glad to see you too. No, we didn't participate in this attack.
And who did it?
I mean, publicly, Bipol announced that they organized this operation, though there are many discussions now about who possibly was behind it. Ukrainian Special Forces, Belarusian partisans. We do believe it was a very well-planned operation, and we respect anyone who organized it. Belarusian partisans will continue their work. It's obvious that Belarusians do not agree with the fact that Russian army is on the territory of Belarus.
What is the current state of the Belarusian army? Is it ready to attack Ukraine together with the Russian troops?
In general, Belarusian army, nothing similar to the Russian army. Belarusian army never had the experience of fighting. It's never been sent. It doesn't have proper ammunition even, and what is more important, it doesn't have a proper motivation. Why do they need to go to Ukraine and kill the nation that we are friends with and never had any problems? The Russian propaganda never been as successful or influential in Belarus before 2020. I mean, those narratives as Ukrainian Nazis and things that have been spread in Russia and in preparation for the nation for this war, or the war that started in 2014, it's more proper to say. So the motivation is very low, and Lukashenko understands the risk. He understands that they might turn over and go after him, or they just won't even agree to go to Ukraine, to be sent to Ukraine. So it's a difficult situation, but of course there are some supporters of the Russian world among the Belarusian army soldiers, like anywhere else, but this support is relatively low from the information we have, and people just don't want to be involved in this in general.
Сейчас Россия. Почему? Страна-агрессор. А в чем агрессор? Начала войну против Украины, нашей братской.
России не особо нравится, по разным причинам.
То есть вам больше приезжают такие более демократические, да, страны?
Абсолютно, да.
То есть Западная Европа там?
Абсолютно,
США.
да.
Корея.
Корея?
Северная.
Почему?
Потому что там такой режим.
Нынешняя ситуация мне не особо приятна.
Нет, это земля. То есть на земле все страны хороши, а вот часто бывает, что правительство этих стран не очень хорошо. Вот это бывает.
Ну, вот
это все временно. Но это все временно, это все меняется.
Я только что сидел 14 суток, и я не хочу дальше продолжать. Не надо дальше.
What do people in Belarus think about the reparations they will have to pay for their complicity in Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine?
I don't think that the question was asked inside Belarus, among inbound Belarusians, even outside of Belarus. It is a difficult question, and even now, like, we have to decide, what's going to happen, how we can change the regime, and it's just I don't see it's possible to actually ask the population about this just because they don't have even updated information on what's going on in Ukraine because of the Belarusian propaganda, because of the Russian propaganda. People live under repressions. It's a so-called concentration camp, and you can't have real surveys inside such of the situation. We do believe that there should be reparations. Lukashenko's regime has to pay for all the damage he committed against the Ukrainian nation. But in general, we don't have information about what people think or believe.
The official speaker of the Belarusian cyber partisan movement, Juliana Shemetovets, speaking live from New York, USA. Juliana, can I ask you, what were the preconditions that provoked the most massive protest meeting in Belarus? And is there a possibility of organizing new action of resistance on the same basis?
Of course, these protests were not organized by someone. People decided to go out to the streets, and these same people haven't forgotten, haven't forgiven what happened after the most massive protest started in 2020. So the revolutionary situation hasn't been resolved. The conflict hasn't been resolved. So yes, as history shows, we should expect some more movements and more participation when the situation changes and repressions change as well. What caused 2020? Well, several reasons. Belarusian population understood that the regime lives in a different era, in the Soviet time era. It doesn't respond to the requirements and the desire of people to be more involved in political life, to be more involved in economic life, how it affects their lives. Of course, also COVID happened when Lukashenko famously responded really badly, saying that it doesn't exist and people have to deal with it on their own. And people became very showed some solidarity. They provided help for the medical hospitals, doctors, and all of it. They realized they can locally change things. They don't need Lukashenko. They don't need any other politicians for them to achieve what they want to achieve. And that also obviously helped them to spark this protest. But also the previous protest in 2006 and 2010, we had other protests and movements. So that was also the foundation for 2020. People knew what symbols they're going out with. It's our white, red, white flag and not the Soviet flag that people took. So of course it was also related to the national movement, and just because we had our past, our history of other movements against the regime, against the occupiers, 2020 happened because of that as well.
What resonant Lukashenko gates can be renewed in the memory of the Belarusian population and can demoralize Lukashenko's regime? And also, please tell us, what are the most shocking cases of human rights violation?
All of the kind of human rights violations that are before, so nothing shocking on there different from what happened before. But what was shocking for us is that how the system is working, how quickly lies monitor social media and they send this information directly to FSB and other agencies related to the Russian regime, so they can go and suppress people local regions. So that efficiency, the way how they control the Russian population is truly surprised us in a sense. As for the conversation that cyber partisans obtained, of course, what shocked us mostly is the brutality, violence, and the intellectual skills of all these police officers who believe that they can abuse Belarusian nation, even though they're supposed to serve them. And we receive still comments and messages from people when they listen to this conversation. They can't believe happening in the 21st century in Belarus. Yet it is happening, and we know all their names, we know all the crimes they committed, and they will answer to them.
Does Lukashenko have agents abroad? And does his regime threaten you, even in the United States of America?
Lukashenko said that no one can hide from him, even opposition outside of Belarus, so he did this type of threats. Yet I haven't received any direct threat inside the United States. Of course, there are agents operating, Belarusian agents, Russian agents. We don't know how well they operate, especially Belarusian agents. They don't have the resources that the Russian agents have, and Russians have a lot on their plate right now. So I haven't felt any threat or fear right now, but it doesn't mean that it might not change.
Another question, according to the legislation of your native country, how should the self-proclaimed president of Belarus be penalized, at least for impersonation with falsification of state symbols and the presidential seal?
The current legislation has been changed by the regime, illegitimately changed, so we don't rely on the new laws that he created. We rely on the laws that were previously adopted in the 1994 or after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We also rely on the European legislation our legislation will be adjusted after the change of the regime. Of course, for all his crimes currently, according to the current legislation, he might face even the capital punishment, though we do believe that it has to be changed. As a European country, Belarus should not have the capital punishment, so Lukashenko will spend the rest of his days in prison.
The self-proclaimed president of Belarus flew to China on the 1st of March, where he received the confirmation of economic cooperation between the both countries. Another result of Lukashenko's visit, according to the analysis at the American Institute for the Study of War, was his agreement to increase military cooperation with China, with the prospect of a possible Chinese military base in Belarus. How does the Belarusian cyber partisans movement assess this prediction?
It's hard to tell right now if this base will actually appear. Obviously, Russia is not going to be happy about that. We also need to account for the funds coming from European, but in general, like the United States. It takes time to build logistically, time to bureaucratically set up this new and bring over the military. Of course, we do have trade relationship with China, and it probably will continue. Will continue after the changes. The same way European countries have good relationship with China, the same way we want to establish good relationship, as long as it doesn't affect our independence. As for the military cooperation in general, probably there is some military trade between these two countries, and depends on what has been sold. Probably it makes sense to produce and sell it to China as well. Again, as long as it doesn't affect Belarusian independence.
Juliana, yesterday your colleague on the Belarusian opposition, leader of the solidarity movement Together, Razum, Vyacheslav Sivchik, said that Lukashenko has made an official visit to China in order to get support in case of a possible Russian occupation of the Belarusian territory. Immediately after his visit, China rejected its previous plan to peacefully resolve the war in Ukraine, and yesterday the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced its readiness not to support Russian aggression in exchange for the United States ending the support for Taiwan's struggle for independence from China. Juliana, does the Belarusian opposition think that Lukashenko can play a double game with Putin?
Lukashenko always played a double game with Putin. Previously, he just used European Union for these games. Now he doesn't have this opportunity, so he went to China and trying to bring over China into his double game. Obviously, he's afraid that Putin might throw him away and take over, send his own person instead of Lukashenko. Lukashenko is afraid of Putin, probably even more than he's afraid of the Belarusian opposition.
How can the movement of Belarusian cyber partisans prevent the Lukashenko regime's practice of leasing the territory of Belarus to other country?
The only way to prevent it for us is to change the regime, change Lukashenko, overthrow the legitimate Lukashenko's regime in Belarus. Now we are doing everything possible to obtain information about his plans, about what's going on in Belarus, about the crimes that he committed and people around him committed, and giving this information to our colleagues in the Kalinovsky regiment, as well as damaging regime by doing the cyber operations. But the only way to change the situation is to change the regime.
And how does your movement predict the situation in Belarus after the Ukraine's victory in the war with Russia?
After Ukraine wins the war, it doesn't automatically mean that Lukashenko will go away, but it will give a lot of opportunities for the Belarusian opposition, for the Belarusian people inside Belarus to change the situation. Without the Russian support, Lukashenko will be very weakened and he won't be able to consolidate everyone around him the way he did in 2020, for example. So, of course, Ukraine right now fights for our freedom and independence as well, and we appreciate it and do everything possible to help Ukraine win in this war.
Слава Україні! Героям слава! Слава Україні! Героям слава! Слава Україні! Героям слава! Слава Україні! Героям слава!
Бегут на...
Меня, получается, уже... Слышишь? Какая ситуация была?
Смотри.
Let me remind you that the official speaker of the Belarusian cyber partisan movement, Juliana Shemetovets, was on the air from the New York, United States of America. Thank you very much.
See you, bye.